Hi, thanks for joining us for today's video. Please keep watching to see a clip from the latest video from our new channel, Paranormally Listed. It's about 3 haunted houses that were made famous by horror movies. But before we start today's video, we want to bring you a word from our fantastic sponsor, HelloFresh. One of my least favorite tasks was meal planning. It's probably because I've never been a very good cook, but I always found it difficult to come up with interesting things to eat every week. But with HelloFresh, I don't have that problem, and I actually look forward to meal planning. Every week, HelloFresh has 50 menu and market items to choose from, including vegetarian, calorie-wise, and gourmet options, so there's plenty of variety. I really like that they have a variety of quick and easy recipes, including 20-minute meals, easy cleanup, and low prep options, because I don't want to spend all night in the kitchen cooking and cleaning. I also think that time management with cooking is important in the fall and winter because life seems so much more hectic. With HelloFresh, not only do I spend less time in the kitchen, but I also spend less time in the grocery store because HelloFresh sends me everything I need to make an awesome meal. They also have great meals that are perfect for cold days, like chicken ramen and shoyu style broth and turkey ragu gnocchi. Not to mention, the food is criminally delicious. HelloFresh has more 5-star reviews than any other meal kit, and I believe it based on my own experience. Last week I made Italian chicken sandwiches with roasted sweet potato fries and pesto aioli. It took a little over half an hour to make. The instructions were so simple that someone like me could follow them, and I'm no chef. The closest I come to fancy cooking is heating up food from a celebrity chef named Hector Boyardee, but these sandwiches were amazing. If I ordered one in a restaurant, I'd go back the next week and order it again. But actually, they weren't difficult to make, so I'm definitely going to make them again for myself in the future. You should check out HelloFresh for yourself because they have a great deal for criminally listed viewers. Go to HelloFresh.com and use the code LISTED14 for up to 14 free meals and 3 free gifts. Once again, just go to HelloFresh.com, use the code LISTED14 for up to 14 free meals and 3 free gifts. Number 3. Terence Paquette. Sometime in the early 1990s, Terence Paquette moved from New Hampshire to Florida. He eventually settled in Orlando, Florida. He got a job as the manager of a convenience store called the Little Champ Food Store. Paquette was a hard worker. He sometimes worked as much as 60 hours a week at the store. Outside of work, he didn't have any hobbies or passions. He was single and he lived alone. He did have some friends, but he was not especially close with anyone. If he went out to a bar with some friends, he didn't drink. On Saturday, February 3rd, 1996, Paquette arrived at work sometime between 5 and 6 a.m. The store was supposed to open at 6 a.m. Sometime after 6 a.m., a customer came into the store because he wanted some change. He knew Paquette. He called out to him, but he didn't get a reply. So he left the store. Around 7 a.m., a person walked by the store and noticed that the lights weren't on. They thought that this was unusual because the store was always open by that time. So they called 911. Officers discovered a horrifying scene when they got to the store. 31-year-old Terence Paquette was dead in the washroom. He had been stabbed 73 times. His throat had also been slit. The cash register was open and empty. Amazingly, no one saw anything unusual that morning. The police think that the customer that came in for change was lucky that he left quickly. They believe that the killer was still in the store at the time. Also, a man had been standing in the store's parking lot between 6 and 7 a.m. waiting for a ride. He did not see anything unusual. The police did find the killer's DNA. He had cut himself during the attack and his blood was all over the store. However, no match to the DNA was found. So after a couple weeks, the case went cold. In 2003, the DNA was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system, also known as CODIS, but no match was found. In 2019, the Orange County Sheriff's Department started a cold case unit. They began to look at Terence Paquette's case, but again, they did not make any arrests. Then in 2021, a forensic genetic genealogy specialist with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement got involved in the case. They determined that the DNA belonged to one of three brothers. One of those brothers was a very promising suspect. He was 54-year-old Kenneth Robert Stowe, Jr. Stowe had worked at the store for a short time, and he was known to frequent it. At the time of the murder, he lived across the street from the store. He was 29 years old at the time of the murder. He did have a criminal record, but it was only for minor crimes. The police ended up trailing Stowe, who lived in Central Florida. One day they watched him as he pulled into a gas station and threw out some empty beer cans. The officers collected the beer cans and had them examined for DNA. DNA was found and it was compared to the killer's DNA. It was a match. In November 2021, 25 years after the murder, 54-year-old Kenneth Robert Stowe Jr. was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Stowe has only admitted to working at the store, and he has said nothing else. The police said that they are still investigating the possible motive. Number 2. Maureen Farley. In 1971, Maureen Farley was 17 years old, and she lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was the eldest of 7 children. Farley had been married for 2 years, but in September 1971, her husband was serving time in a men's reformatory. She worked as a waitress at a diner in Cedar Rapids. Farley was living paycheck to paycheck. So on September 17, 1971, when she didn't pick up her paycheck, her employer thought it was odd. Farley was supposed to work 3 days later on September 20th, and she was considered reliable. When she didn't show up for her shift or called to say that she wasn't coming in, her employer reported her missing to the police. On September 24th, about 7 days after Farley was last seen, 2 boys were hunting in a ravine in Cedar Rapids. They found the dead body of 17-year-old Maureen Farley on the trunk of a junked-out car. She was clothed, but her shoes were missing. Even though she had not been seen for a week, the medical examiner thought she had only been dead for 48 to 96 hours. The police thought that she might have been held somewhere, or she was possibly taken out of town. But what was odd was that Farley's car was found parked outside of her apartment and it had a full tank of gas. So if she did leave town, she most likely didn't go in her car. Farley was killed by a single, brutal blow to the right side of her head with a blunt instrument. The medical examiner was never able to determine what was used to kill her. She had also been sexually assaulted. The police figured out that only a few things had been stolen from Farley. The first was her purse, which contained her wallet. The second were her shoes. When Farley's body was found, her feet were clean, so she probably wasn't barefoot before she died. Her purse, her wallet, and her shoes have never been found. The police had several suspects, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone. So the case went cold. In 2006, there was a review of the case, and some evidence was examined for DNA. Some male DNA was found, but no match to the DNA was found. In 2015, the case was opened again. 2 years later, the police collected DNA from 15 potential suspects and compared it to the killer's DNA. None of them were a match. In 2021, the police believed that they had finally zeroed in on a suspect. His name was George Merlin Smith. He was 52 years old at the time of Farley's murder. Between 1931 and 1938, Smith played in the A&L Baseball League and he boxed. He worked at the diner with Farley, and he also worked at a liquor store near her apartment. For some reason, Farley's mother knew about Smith and suspected that he was the killer. She wrote a letter to the police department 6 months after her daughter's death and accused Smith of killing her. The police had interviewed Smith after the murder and he denied being responsible. He was asked to take a polygraph exam, but he declined. While he was considered a person of interest, the police never had enough evidence to charge him with anything. George Smith died in February 2013 at the age of 94. He had 8 children, 23 grandchildren, 32 grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. On September 24, 2021, the 50th anniversary of Maureen Farley's murder, the police got a warrant to get a DNA sample from one of Smith's relatives. In October 2021, the police announced that based on the DNA testing, George Smith was Farley's killer. Since he was dead, they couldn't prosecute him, but they did say the case was closed. Farley's family said it was nice to get closure, but they are still angry it took so long to solve the case and that the killer died without facing justice. Number 1. Candy Rogers. In March 1959, 9-year-old Candace Rogers, who went by the name Candy, lived with her mother in West Central Spokane, Washington. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, Candy went out to sell campfire mints in her neighborhood for a Bluebird group. Sadly, she never returned home. As the sun was setting, massive searches were conducted for the 9-year-old girl. Boxes of campfire mints were found dumped beside a road, but no other trace of Candy was found. For over 2 weeks, thousands of people helped search for Candy. An Air Force helicopter that was involved in the search crashed and 3 people were killed. 15 days after Candy went missing, 2 men were hunting about 7 miles from her home. They found a pair of children's shoes. The next morning, the police searched the area where the shoes were found, and they found the dead body of 9-year-old Candy. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with a piece of her own clothing. Unfortunately, it was not long before the case went cold. Then, a few years after the murder, the police developed a suspect, Hugh Morris. Morris had committed a series of rapes and sexual assaults on women and girls in Spokane. He was also a serial killer. On November 7, 1959, he broke into the home of 28-year-old Gloria Bree, who lived in Spokane. He raped her and beat her to death. Less than a year later, on September 26, 1960, he raped and beat 69-year-old Blanche Boggs to death. A month later, on October 28, 1960, Morris broke into his estranged wife's home. He tried to strangle her to death, but she fought him off, and he fled. His estranged wife reported the attack. The police went to arrest Morris, but he was nowhere to be found. It turned out that he had left Spokane. Morris was added to the FBI's most wanted list. On July 11, 1961, Morris broke into the home of 27-year-old Bobby Ann Landy in Birmingham, Alabama. He sexually assaulted her and beat her to death. In September 1961, Morris was living in St. Paul, Minnesota. On September 18, 1961, he raped and strangled 34-year-old Carol Ronan in her home. Some people in St. Paul saw that Morris was on the FBI's most wanted list, and they reported him to the FBI. He was arrested several weeks after Ronan's murder. After he was arrested, he was questioned about Candy Rogers' murder, and he denied committing it. But he did say that if he did kill her, he would be too ashamed to talk about it. The police thought that they had some evidence that connected him to Candy's murder. Morris liked to chew gum that was grape-flavored. A purple stain was found on Candy's clothes, and it smelled like grape. But the police did not believe that this was enough evidence to charge him with Candy's murder. Morris pleaded guilty to killing Carol Ronan, and he was given 2 life sentences. For decades, he was the prime suspect in the murder of Candy Rogers. Amazingly, the evidence from Candy's murder was well preserved. In 2001, the evidence was examined for DNA. Male DNA was found. In 2002, Morris's DNA was compared to the DNA. It was not a match. Hugh Morris died in prison in April 2003 at the age of 72. Candy's case continued to sit cold for nearly another 2 decades. A detective said that Candy's murder was the Mount Everest of their cold cases. Then, in 2020, the DNA evidence was sent to Othram Incorporated, a private laboratory in Texas that specializes in developing profiles from degraded DNA and genetic genealogy. They created a new DNA profile and narrowed the suspect list down to 3 brothers. When the daughter of one of the potential suspects learned that her father was a suspect, she voluntarily gave a sample of her DNA. In November 2021, 62 years after Candy's murder, the police announced that they had found her killer. His name was John Ray Hoff, and when Candy was killed, he was 20 years old. He lived about a mile from her home. Hoff, who grew up in Spokane, had a juvenile criminal record. When he was 17, he joined the army and he served in Korea. In 1961, he grabbed a woman in Spokane, bound her with her own clothes, and strangled her. She survived, and Hoff was arrested. He ended up serving 6 months in jail for the assault. After he was released, he sold cutlery door to door. He also worked in a lumber yard and a meatpacking plant. At some point, he suffered chemical burns on his face. John Hoff was 31 years old. He shot himself in the head. He was buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The police had his body exhumed in 2021 to get a DNA sample. When his family learned that he was the killer, they had his body buried in a different cemetery. John Hoff's daughter, who was born after Candy's murder and was 9 years old when her father died, always assumed that her father took his own life because he was depressed. Now she believes that her father was evil and his death was an escape. She said he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man. Thank you so much for watching today's video. And now here's a clip from our new video, 3 haunted houses made famous by horror movies, on our new channel, Paranormally Listed. The mass murder was just the start of the Amityville house lore. In 1975, George and Kathleen Lutz moved their 3 children into the Amityville home. They were there for just 28 days before they left in the middle of the night. George said he would wake up at 3:15 every morning, which is thought to be around the time that the DeFeo family was murdered. He said he saw his wife levitate off their bed. The family and visitors experienced cold spots in their home. Doors weighing as much as 250 pounds would somehow be torn off their hinges and tossed aside. A knife was knocked around in the kitchen. People said that they saw an image of a demon in the fireplace. Some people saw something with a pig face and glowing red eyes looking in through the windows. You can find a link to Paranormally Listed on the top left hand of the screen. You can also find a link in the description below this video. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.